All right, so to try and keep us on schedule, I'm now going to begin by introducing the head table for today's invited address. So starting at my far left is Peter Vander. He's a professor at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. He's a longtime member of the International Atlantic Economic Conference, a longtime member of the IAER board. He's a program committee member and a former member of the executive committee. Seated next to Peter is Charles Calamiris, who's the current president of the International Atlantic Economic Society. He's the Henry Kaufman Professor of Finance Institutions at Columbia Business School and a visiting fellow at the International Monetary Fund. And then now that Gordon is seated at the far end is Gordon Brady, formerly senior economist, Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Senate, currently a member of the IAES Executive Committee and a longtime member of the AEJ Board of Editors. So at this point, I will turn the podium over to Gordon to introduce our speaker.
Actually, Luigi is a man who needs no introduction. I do have a, can I just go through this? Or I have my own little.
Sure, get it in there.
Maybe someone needs to help me get that, but. Luigi, you were at Lake Como?
Tonight, yeah.
Oh, okay. We have to pick mine up. Milano. Right there.
This one?
Yeah. Well, I think most everyone knows that Luigi Zingales is probably the most prominent Italian academic in the U.S. He's professor of economics at the Booth School at the University of Chicago. Currently, he's on leave, or was on leave, at Harvard, possibly working with his close Bocconi colleague, Alberto Alesina, who was president of the Atlantic in 2011 and 12. Professor Zingales received his bachelor degree in economics summa cum laude from the University of Bocconi in 1987. He has a PhD from MIT. He is the author of numerous articles and an extremely popular lecturer throughout the world. His two major, perhaps most recent books are Saving Capitalism from Capitalist, which he co-authored, and it's widely regarded as one of the most powerful defenses of the free market ever written. Another book is Capitalism for the People, Recapturing the Lost Genius of American Prosperity. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Zingales and his presentation of Diagnosing the Italian Disease. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. I think that actually Alberto is a much more prominent economist than me, so I think it's a bit unfair to say I'm the most prominent Italian economist in the States. But what I want to discuss today is something that is very important. It's very important not only for Italy, but I think for the entire European system and for the world at large. And the fact that I want to try to explain is a fact that is very well known among Italians, but probably not so much about other people, and is the fact that Italy stopped growing in productivity for the last 20 years. Okay, and you see that until 1994, 95, Italy was growing in productivity as everybody else, and then in 1995, stopped completely. And you see, there was a little bit of a divergence between the United States that accelerated a bit and Europe that slowed down a bit, but the overwhelming factor is that Italy stopped. And this is before the financial crisis. So I hope I will not disappoint you by saying that I'm not going to talk about the financial crisis at all. Okay? That's for a change, because everybody talks about that and the consequences. I'm going to talk about stuff that was there before. And of course, the financial crisis only made this stuff much worse. But the important thing, it was there before. Now, to put these things in context, let me show you this picture. And this picture decomposes the GDP per capita in its three factors: the hours worked per employee, the employment over population, so with a fraction of people working, and then the real productivity, which is GDP per hour worked. Now, what I find it fascinating of this picture, if you look down to the extreme left, Japan, we all heard about Japan 2 lost decades. And if you look at the real measure of productivity in Japan, i.e. GDP per hour worked, over the last 15 years actually grew at a healthy rate of 1 point something per year. So why we think Japan was such a freaking disaster? Because we look at GDP, or GDP per capita, not at GDP per hour worked. And in Japan, there are two factors that this is pre-Abenomics, whatever is the name, Abenomics. But pre-Abenomics, two factors were quite important. Number one, employment over population went down. This is simply demographic. People get old and they retire. And there are not enough young people entering the workforce. And we know Japan is not particularly good at importing people from other countries. So the result is that number of workers per population went down. And also the number of hours per employee went down a bit. But this is simply regression to the mean, because Japanese were working much more than Europeans and Americans. Doesn't take much to work more than Europeans, but even more than Americans. And so the fact that they went to the average is not that surprising. So once you factor these two things together, actually Japan did not do that poorly, at least productivity-wise, during the last 15 years. But Italy did. Italy and Spain. Now, Spain, this is covered up a bit by the fact that during this period, this is pre-crisis, of course, you had a huge employment boom in Spain. Spain started the new millennium with very high unemployment, went down until 2007, 2008, and then went back up. So because this stops pre-crisis, you see an increase in employment over population, and so this covers the fact that Italy and Spain don't see their productivity grow almost at all during this period. This is cumulative growth during this period and is close to zero. And the question is why? Because as an Italian, I can tell you there are a lot of things that go wrong in Italy. The problem is that I'm old enough to remember they were wrong, or almost as bad, sometimes even worse, 30 or 40 years ago. And Italy was growing at a healthy rate. So the puzzle, which I think is an important puzzle, is what happened. So how do I go about trying to sort of deal with that puzzle? The first one is I try to look at what are the best data to do it. And it turns out that one of the few things that the European Union does right is that they produce some good statistics. And one of the statistics called EU CLAMS is a very good database of value-added, output, input, and total factor productivity per country and per sector. And so at the beginning, you start with a healthy set of countries, particularly 25 Europeans plus some major industrialized countries outside of Europe. But then, sort of, when you look at the data, many of them drop out. So at the end of the day, we only have 15 countries. Mostly European, and 15 countries, which is not great. And so with 15 observations, there is not much you can do in a pure cross-country regression. Now, fortunately, this data set does not contain only countries, contains also sectors. And also here we have to do a little bit of work to aggregate and clean up, and we end up with 23 sectors. So again, not enough sectors to do much if you limit to the cross-sectional variation. However, if you start to exploit the combination between sector and countries, you have much more room to do stuff. And let me show you, this is the list of the sectors, and it's probably way too small for most people to see. However, what I want to point out are two factors. If you compare both total factor productivity and value added per hour work, which is labor productivity, in Italy and in the rest of this sample, Italy is below basically in every sector except post and telecommunication. Okay? And I have to say, remember, we're not looking at levels, so it's not that the Italian telecommunication are particularly good. We're looking at changes. So during this period, Italian productivity in post and telecommunication, maybe because started so low, grew a teeny tiny bit more than the rest of the bunch, but that's the only exception. In every other sector, there is a lag. Now, at the end of the paper, I will complement our analysis with some firm-level data. Now, the beauty of this is, of course, is much richer. The limitation is, number one, there are only 6 countries, and number two, is not really a long time series, so I can't look at change in productivity. So I will limit myself to cross-sectional variation, and I will limit myself to cross-sectional variation to investigate further some of the issues that the data by sector and countries have identified. So let me start with a very simple summary statistic. And I'm warning you, this paper is extremely simple and is basically a data search. Is like, we call it diagnosing because it's like the doctor trying to sort of get some summary statistics from the patient to see what's wrong and eventually come up with a conjecture. As we know, doctors come up with conjectures, not necessarily with the answer. We hope that then they can fix us, and as economists, we hope we can do the same, but there is always a degree of uncertainty. So this is a way to present the data, and it's basically regressing on the left-hand side the changes in the first column is labor productivity over this period, regress at the beginning on a set of sector fixed effects, and an Italian dummy. So the first regression say that if you look at labor productivity, Italy fell 20% behind everybody else in this sample, keeping constant the sector. So that's a pretty large number in what, a 12 years period, falling behind 20%. And the second regression is that if you, instead of doing sort of a regression, putting labor productivity on the left, you put changes in total factor productivity on the left. The results are pretty similar. They are slightly better, so is only 13% rather than 20%. So already we can get some action or some answer, which is some of the lack of growth in labor productivity in Italy is due to lack of investments, because in one case is 19% and the other is 13%. So a bit is due to lack of investments. And in fact, in the next two regressions, I put on the left the ICT capital contribution. ICT stands for Innovation and Communication Technology. And on the fourth column, the non-ICT capital. And you see that Italy falls below or behind those two sets of investment with respect to the other countries, but is nowhere in terms of magnitude vis-a-vis the change in labor productivity. So I think lack of investments are a little bit of the explanation. There is still a lot that we need to explain. And the last one, we try to look at composition in terms of education and age. While marginally significant, I think is not really important from a quantitative point of view, so I can ignore that. So what can explain this lack of productivity growth in Italy during this period? So, as I said at the beginning, theories don't lack. What we desperately need are actually testing theories with data. Especially if you listen to the Italian political debate, everybody has his own pet theory. Nobody has any data point to back the theory. In fact, data point I consider redundant to the discussion. So let's try to see some of the most obvious claims that have been done, not necessarily in the political circle, but also in the economic circle and so on and so forth. So one has to do with Italy suffering a bad firm demographic, where the firm demographic can both be interpreted as a size distribution. Italian firms tend to be fairly small in size, and also in terms of sectoral distribution. How could it be wrong? If you just happen to specialize in sectors that don't grow a lot, then you are in trouble. And so if Italy was made of all musicians that play a quartet, the productivity of a quartet does not go up because it takes 4 people to play a quartet. And it took it at the time of Mozart, and it takes it today. So it's hard to improve productivity on that front. So that's one story. The second, which is extremely popular in the political debate, is lack of labor flexibility. The third, which is also very popular, is somewhat government inefficiency. And the fourth one, because we know human capital is so important, could be some deficiency in human capital accumulation during this period. And, being Italian, I can tell you that I can see a potential reason. The Italian university and the Italian school system was really destroyed by the '68 revolution that decided that meritocracy was a bad word because it was discriminating in favor of the rich. And so everybody should get the same grade, and everybody should study very little because then we're all equal. I think the possibility of a deterioration in quality of human capital is a serious possibility. So now let's try to get the data to speak on this front. And on the sectoral thing, I already told you basically that cannot be, because when you control for sector fixed effect, the result is the same. But let me do another way, which I find it very sort of easy to explain, which is imagine that Italy had each of its sectors grow at the average of that sector for the other country. How much Italy would have grown in productivity during this period? And the answer is, you can see comparing the first and the second column, Italy would have grown 21%, and instead grew 1.8. So cannot be really the sectoral distribution. We do the same also in terms of size. You divide firms by sort of size categories, and then you assume that Italian firms will grow as a function of the average growth of that size group in the other countries. And again, you see the predicted level would be 27, and Italy grow at 1.8. And then you even slice more, and you say, suppose that we attribute to each intersection between size and sector the same value of the average of the other country. How much Italy would have grown? And here we arrive to 30%. So we are even going in the worst direction, okay? In the bad direction. And Italy still grew at 1.8. Now, the other thing that you see is this trend seems to be common to Spain as well. So keep this in mind. This does not seem just an Italian disease, might seem also a Spanish disease. And Greece is not in the sample. Now, it's because the data are not good, so I'm not so sure it's a reason to be proud of. But so, given that we can't we can't find anything on the sector and demographic, let's look to labor flexibility. And as we know, until a week ago, the new government has changed labor law, but until a week ago, Italy had a fairly inflexible labor market. Now, the good news, or I don't know whether it's good news, but the news is, in that respect, it's not very different from most European countries. It's definitely different than United States and United Kingdom and a bit of Ireland, but continental European countries are pretty much at the same level. So just looking at these statistics, you say it's basically impossible that labor flexibility with this little difference with Germany can explain by itself the gigantic gap between Italy and Germany in terms of productivity growth. However, we want to do something more clever and say we can exploit the interaction between cross-country and cross-sectoral variation by saying in which sector you need labor flexibility the most. So if you are in a sector that is booming, you don't need to fire people. And so the fact that labor law is not very flexible is not really a hindrance to your sort of productivity growth. On the other hand, if you have a sector that needs a lot of change, think about the textile sector, the traditional textile sector disappeared, now you have new textile sector driven by special fibers and so on and so forth, you need a lot of turnover, you need a lot of flexibility, you need a lot of labor movement. There, labor flexibility is very important. So how do you measure the sectoral need of labor flexibility? The answer I always given, so I'm not particularly original, is to look at the United States. And you think that the United States has a fairly free labor movements. And so let's look at the layoffs of workers in the United States by sector. And not surprisingly, as I told you, textile needs a lot of layoffs, and hotels and restaurants, not so much. And so can we find that in countries where labor flexibility is lacking, sectors that need a lot of layoff have a lower productivity growth? And the answer is no, at least not significantly so. So if you see the interaction, the second column has the interaction between employment protection and US layoff rate, and that coefficient is not statistically significant. You change the measure of labor freedom, nothing changes. So there is no evidence that this seems to be an important factor in the lack of productivity growth. Now, you can argue that this might have other negative effect and etc., but at least here I don't find any evidence. Now, if we go to government efficiency, now we start to be a bit more excited, because if you look at the difference, if you look at this picture, you see that Italy is doing tremendously worse than everybody else. So here at least you have some potential action. Now, this is one measure. This is the days needed to enforce a contract. There are other measures, days it takes for a letter sent to the wrong address to come back. We also thought about quality of education measured by PISA scores in public schools. Now, in all these sort of measures, Italy do worse. And this is probably the one where Italy has the largest gap vis-a-vis everybody else. So this is where we have the most mileage to try to actually show that this is what drives the phenomenon. What is problematic is we can't really use just the cross-section, because I told you we have 15 countries, and so many things change across countries that you can't really have any identifying power. So we need to find out how different sectors need government input. And this is where I have to say we are in weak territory, because we couldn't find any measure of the CAF in the literature. And so we ended up building our own, and I think it's a pretty interesting measure, but it's for you to judge. So to determine the impact of government in the sector, what we do is we first collect all the news in a certain period on Factiva talking about a certain sector. And then we redo the search, adding as a criterion that it should talk to that sector and have the word government in it, and take the ratio between the two. And that is a measure, basically, how important is, at least in the news, the government vis-a-vis an industry. Now, what do we find? Actually, we find that for agriculture, the government is pretty damn important. And that's not a bad measure. And if you go down, you find that for basic metals, the government is not that important. Now, as I said, this is what the data tells us. We use it. We think is reasonable, but this is probably the weakest part of our paper. And now, what is interesting is if you put simply the variable itself, so days to enforce a contract, there is a clear negative correlation between total factor productivity growth and days it takes to enforce a contract. However, as I told you, we have 15 observations there, basically, 15 degrees of freedom, so it's not really a very powerful regression. So that's the reason why in column 2, what we do is we control for country and sector fixed effect, and we look at the interaction between the days to enforce a contract and government dependence, and we find basically nothing. And you can try different measures, no results whatsoever. Now, the third thing is quality of human capital. Here, we actually have the benefit of being able to use a new data set. I'm sure you're familiar with this PISA, which is the OECD measure of quality of education through tests. So they test 15-year-old kids to see how good they are in resolving some problems, and they rate schools based on that. The OECD has just released, 6 months ago, has released a new data set that tries to do the same with adult people. So that's a measure actually of the workforce, not of the people incoming in the labor force, but of the workforce. And if you look at changes in this quality, so that's delta log PIAC, and you do, again, a cross-country regression, you find a positive coefficient. So not surprisingly, countries that have more sort of high-quality workers enter in the labor force, actually, to be precise, countries where the quality of the labor force went up during this period experience a higher productivity growth. However, it's hard to make a conclusion based on this because, as I told you, lack of degrees of freedom. When we interact the change in quality of labor force with the right sorting variable, here, unlike in the government, we have a natural sorting variable, which is the labor compensation share. It must be that the impact of having higher quality worker is more important when labor share is more important. And here we find nothing. So again, we arrive to the conclusion it does not seem to be this important factor. Now we're going to more dangerous political territory. When I show you that picture, there was one fact that was remarkable. And the fact was remarkable is that the stop of Italy growth in productivity happens basically the same year in which Italy entered the parity that later will lead to the euro. So it's almost to the month. And we know in economics that correlation is not causation. In the political debate, it's very hard to resist a nice picture when you see that the two things happen exactly at the same time. And so there is a huge sort of group of people in Italy that think that the reason why Italy stopped growing is because we entered the euro and because we can't devalue. Now, let me sort of set this straight from an economic point of view. Now, it's clear that temporarily a devaluation can increase demand, and at a short period of time might even increase productivity. Over the long term, is strange to argue that lack of demand will lead to a decline or lack of growth of productivity. In fact, the argument is probably the other way around. It says, if you have intense competition from abroad, either because your real exchange rate is overvalued or because, by the way, this is the other story that is pretty common and pretty powerful, is because China entered the WTO, and so Italy had to face the competition of Chinese product. If you think about those two reasons, you should think that productivity actually should grow faster. Why? Because, number one, intense competition from abroad will force more firms to exit, and generally firms that exit are the less efficient ones, the less productive. So a pure compositional effect will lead to increase in productivity. Even if no firm individually will increase productivity, the average productivity will increase because you cut off the lower end of distribution. So that's a pretty strong effect. Second, if you want to survive, if you have intense competition, the best ways to survive is to improve productivity. And so in a sector without competition, we know from Hicks that the biggest luxury of a monopoly is quiet life. So if you are in a monopoly or in a not very competitive sector, you can afford a quiet life. You're not forced to grow that fast. But if there is intense competition, then you must increase productivity. However, in spite of the fact it doesn't make any sense in theory, I thought that was important to test it in practice, just to see maybe 12 years are not a long term. Maybe we're still in the short term. I doubt, but it's worth thinking. So if we are sympathetic, this I'm really doing an effort, if I try to be sympathetic to these demand-driven stories, what are the channels that can drive this effect? And I could think of 4 channels. The first one is a scale effect. If there are gigantic economies of scale, and my demand drops, I cannot exploit the full economy of scale, so my productivity might go down. The second, which I might think actually has some validity, is imagine that a country where there is not a lot of R&D, that is actually Italy, by the way, and where productivity growth takes place mostly through the purchase of new equipment. So if you every so often buy some new equipment, the new equipment is faster and better, more productive, and so this is called embedded technological progress. So you don't need to do a lot of R&D, you don't need to be very smart, the only thing you need to do is change your equipment often. And if demand is very intense, you're going to change, you need to grow and you're going to change your equipment very often. If demand is stagnating or declining, you don't invest, you don't change your equipment, and you're not going to grow. Then there is a third channel that I'm sure that Charlie is sympathetic to, that goes through profits. If demand goes down, profits go down. If you have no profits, you have no investment. No investment, hard to improve productivity. And the fourth one, again, we're back to labor adjustment costs. In a short term, we know that when you have a negative shock to demand and you cannot fire people, by arithmetic, productivity will go down, right? Because production will go down, the workforce will not be shedded because you can't shed it fast enough, and productivity will go down. So now, these are all possible channels in the short term. Again, is there any evidence of the case? So in the first 2 columns, we put changes in productivity over this period, and we look at, number 1, changes in the trade surplus of that country in that sector, and 2, we do it interacted with firms' size in the United States. Why? That's a proxy for efficient scale. And the answer is no effect. So even trying to be as sympathetic as possible to this theory of demand, we cannot find it here. And we cannot find it also in a term of labor protection. So if it's true that the problem of productivity is that I cannot fire people fast enough in sectors where China is entering and creating a lot of disruption, I should see an effect of the interaction between employment protection and change in Chinese export. We don't find any. We do, however, find, and this is the last column, an interaction between the changes in Chinese export and the average firm size. And this impact, however, is positive and significant. So this is saying is that if I'm in a sector that receives a lot of Chinese competition, if in that sector firms are relatively large, this large firm will react, innovating and being more productive. Okay, so here we might have a hint of what might go on in Italy in sort of, you have a lot of Chinese competition and the average size of firms is small and they seem unable to adjust. Let me actually tell you an anecdote, which of course is worth as much as one data point, but is interesting because fits this story perfectly. In Chicago, I have a good friend who used to be an importer of Italian shoes to Chicago. And his market niche was to import private labels from the area around Florence. Why? Because in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, there were a lot of small producers that produced a very high quality shoe without the price of a Prada or Ferragamo, but with very nice design and very nice quality. And that made a market, and he was very successful. He had closed the store in Chicago, not for lack of demand in Chicago, for lack of supply from Italy. Why? Because the Prada and the Ferragamo of this world outsourced production in China, so their productivity went very high, especially one production in Italy because it's basically only value added, but their prices relatively did not go up as much. The local private labels who could not outsource in China at prices that were relatively too high to compete with the Prada store. And because they didn't have a label, they couldn't really expand and outsource, so they end up dying. So this is maybe something that is going on in this. And there is a little bit of evidence. Now I start to look at the number of observations. Here I start to use the firm level data. There is a bit of evidence that firms that face the competition from China and India innovate more. This is an ordered logit or probit, where on the left-hand side there is a number of times they answer yes to a questionnaire about sort of innovation, and on the right-hand side there is a self-reported, do you face competition from China or India, and you see there is a positive correlation, which is indicative that there is something going on there. However, it's still not enough. And we're still missing one important factor. So I told you that two major things happened in the mid-90s or late 90s. One was the introduction of the euro. The second was the entry of China in the WTO. There's a third factor which is actually pretty important, and this is known as the information and communication technology revolution. Here in the graph, I show what is the investment in IT capital stock per hours worked in the United States and Europe. And you see a huge acceleration of the United States, and you see an acceleration of Europe, but less sort of dramatic. And this acceleration investment led to also a productivity miracle in the United States. I don't know whether you remember, but in the late 90s, in the middle of the bubble, Greenspan was celebrating how the new productivity growth will lead sort of the United States to a new golden era and the Dow Jones to 3,600 or whatever. 36,000. And the important point is this ICT innovation was actually an important factor. Now, why this might matter for Italy? The answer is, we know from literature from Bloom et al. That Europeans seems to be particularly bad in taking advantage of the ICT revolution. In fact, in this paper of 2012, the title is Americans do it better. Of course, it refers just to technological innovation. And they seem to suggest that the Americans were better able to take advantage of this ICT revolution because their organizational style was more synergistic to the use of ICT. And so our guess is maybe the Italian disease is just an extreme form of the European disease. If on average Europe is not very good at developing ICT, maybe Italy is particularly bad. So before we go into any sophisticated analysis, let's do the simplest possible thing. Let's sort of do a regression in which on the left-hand side, like in most of the regressions here, we have the increase in total factor productivity during this period. And on the right, we have country and sector fixed effect. And then an Italy dummy interacted with the level of investment in ICT in the country that is most friendly to ICT, which is Finland. And here we find a huge negative significant coefficient. So this is a huge red flag to say maybe there is something important here. Okay? Notice that here I'm not saying that this explains why Italy falls behind, but it explains why some sectors in Italy fall even more behind than others. Okay? And that is due to ICT. So here, and I will keep it short because there are a lot of regression and I don't want to put everybody to sleep, but we try various measures of network readiness. This is a World Economic Forum statistics, and interact where it lines up, as you expect, with the Northern European country to be very good and the Southern European country being very bad. We interact this with ICT contribution. This is actually investment per sector. And what we find is there is a pretty strong and statistically significant coefficient. So it seems that this is really going the right direction. We do a lot of variation. Now, one issue is what is really hidden behind this ICT readiness? Because it's a statistics that we get from the World Economic Forum, but we don't really grasp what represents. So it could represent a proxy for quality of managers. We know from Bloom et al. That better management is able to exploit ICT better. Or it could really be a way in which management is selected and rewarded. So the World Economic Forum has this interesting statistic, has two sort of measures. One is perceived favoritism in officials' decision-making, and the other is degree of meritocracy in the selection of the private sector managers. And what we find is that also this meritocracy variable lines up, as you expect, with Northern European country doing very well and Southern European country doing very poorly. And it works very well in the interaction with ICT contribution, while quality of management like GMAT scores or quality of management schools don't seem to have an impact. So there seems to be an interaction between these two. So to understand this better, we actually rely on a very interesting paper by Garicano and Heaton. What they do is trying to explain increase in productivity in police departments in the United States with the use of ICT. Now, what is great about this is they measure police department productivity as number of murderers. And because these tend not to be misreported, that's a pretty reliable statistic, okay? And what they show, and actually, for those of you who are American, they will recognize this picture because this is William Bratton, the New York police commissioner, mostly famous for having eradicated crime in New York. This is, crime in New York was terrible in the late 80s, early 90s, and today New York is extremely safe, while unfortunately I have to report that the city where I live in, which is Chicago, is still pretty a disaster. And in 2012, I was telling my wife to reassure when I was traveling. In 2012, more people were killed per inhabitants in Chicago than in Baghdad. So, but the interesting thing, besides the statistics, the interesting thing is that what they document is not enough to buy a lot of computers to decrease crime, not surprisingly. You need that investment, but you need that investment interacted with a different style of management. And the different style of management is basically what we call professional management. So measurable goals, internal accountability, empowerment of middle management, and very high rewards for results. The way I like to tell this story, I hope there are not too many French in the room, but the way I like to tell the story is sort of think about the introduction of tanks in military history. At the beginning of World War II, the French had more tanks than the Germans on the Western Front. They lost in 24 days. Why? Because the French used the tanks in the old-fashioned way. Every platoon had its own pet tank. And the German understood that you need to revolutionize the way you do do war, and they created panzer divisions. So, in a sense, think about ICT technology as something as disruptive as tanks, hopefully less disastrous, but as disruptive. You need a change in management to take advantage of that. So, what do we do? Now we go to the firm level data and say, is it true that there is a correlation between quality of management and management style and ITC usage? And so we have a bunch of questions in this data set where they ask how much you use IT, and these are the questions. And then we have a bunch of questions that help us determine where you fall in what Bandiera et al. Call the trade-off between performance-based management and loyalty. So at the one extreme, you have loyalty where you are promoted because you've been around long and because you're a friend of mine, or even worse, a relative. On the other hand is you are promoted because you are smart and you work hard. Okay? Those are the two extremes. And you can see here all this measure, how they enter into this. And now what we find is not surprising that you are going to use much more IT when you have a performance-oriented management. It's not shocking, but that leads to some evidence in that direction. And also that when you have more performance-oriented management, you have higher TFP. This is level, not growth. Now, Italy does very poorly on this performance-oriented management, and the question is why? So, if this performance-oriented management is such a drag, why people don't adjust? Now, in France, you know why people are not adjusting, because the old generals like to have pets, tanks. And so each general wanted his own tank, or his own endowment of tanks. So they fought in a political battle, and tanks were allocated based on how powerful the generals were, not how useful those tanks were for the generals. So what is the explanation? Now, with a war is pretty intense competition, so the French learn and they change. Or at least the Americans came and brought the better way to do it. Patton, by the way, Patton was one of the few people in America who understood, Guderian was in Germany, and Patton was in America, understood the new way of conducting war. So literally Patton brought a way with him in France when he came back. So, but in Italy, why in Italy we have so much loyalty-based management rather than performance-based management? And the answer, in my way, is that there must be some benefit of being and now I froze everything. There might be some benefit of being loyalty-based in Italy. So can I get some help? Because now I did something strange. I touched something that I shouldn't, and now, what? Maybe I do X. Wow. You see ICT technology. So what is interesting is, I think I'm fine. What is interesting is that, look at the first column. On the left is access to public funds. So these are 10,000 firms across Europe, and the first coefficient says that the more you have performance-based management, the easier it is to have access to public funds, which makes sense in the sense the more efficient, the more funds. Now, look at the interaction coefficient between performance-oriented management and Italy. So not only that the interaction as a negative coefficient, which is the opposite of the other one, but in terms of magnitude, is twice as big. So when you sum the two coefficients, you can say that in Italy, firms that have better management or more professionally oriented management gets less public funds. Unlike most other European countries, that's the case in Italy. So maybe the reason why Italians don't have professional-based management is because relationships are important to get government funds. And this is more than offset the benefits of having a better management that receive technology better. Now, the same is true actually for credit. Look at the second column. This is how much information the bank asks you to give you credit. And first coefficient is saying the more you are performance-oriented, the less information the bank asks you, which makes perfect sense because if you are better organized, the bank trusts you more and will give you more money. Look at the coefficient interaction, Italy with this variable. Sign, opposite, magnitude, more than twice. So if you add the two, in Italy, the more performance-oriented you are, the more difficult it is for banks to give you credit because they ask you a lot more information. So what is going on? Banks in Italy give money to their friends. You don't need to have a performance-oriented management. In fact, it's an obstacle because if it's performance-oriented, God forbid you have a good management, not your relative. And so it's not in the same circle as the banker and he's not going to receive money. So long story short is the lack of meritocracy in Italy had made it difficult to actually import the ICT and take full advantage of the ICT. And this is lag, has created the lag in growth. And so this is the conclusion, which I'm sorry to report to Charlie, I don't think are unique to Italy. And it says, for sure, we know apply to Spain, are likely to happen to Greece as well. And they create, in my view, a big, big question mark. Because suppose that there are some institutional factors that makes it difficult for Southern European country to actually keep up with the technological increase. Then this is not good news for the long-term survival of the euro. Why? Because imagine that Japan and the United States had been in the same currency union from 1950 to 1990, when Japan was growing in terms of productivity at twice the rate of the United States. It would not have worked, okay? And it's not what Mandel said, a shock, because a shock, by definition, is something that happens once in a while. Otherwise, it's not a shock. Here we're talking about constant improvement. So if, for whatever reason, there are some organizational sort of barriers that makes it difficult for Southern Europe to keep up at the same technological growth rate as Northern Europe, the euro is sort of is not going to survive. Now, the good news or the positive view is people will realize and they will be forced to change, right? Because there's nothing intrinsic. It's not that Southern European are really more stupid than Northern European. at least on average. So they will eventually update. However, this is, this brings my sort of history as an Italian. We have tried this experiment with the south and the north of Italy. They had different culture. We put them together for 150 years, hoping that things would work out. And unfortunately, what happened is that now the north look much more like the south and not the other way around. Thank you.
Well, Luigi, thank you so much for that wonderful speech. I think we have time for a few questions. Let's take a few questions. We have a microphone too. I see a hand right here. Wait for the microphone if you don't mind. We'll come back to you.
Sorry, my name is Brigitte Granville. My accent will tell you I'm French. I work in the UK. Anyway, I'd like to go back to your question about the French and the tanks. And especially, you have a slide called government ineffectiveness. Or
Yeah.
if you don't mind, I was very surprised because it kind of contradicts your line about the French tanks. Because I think in your slide, the French are doing pretty well. And I'm very surprised. So if you could just explain why the French government suddenly is doing so well. Thank you.
It's difficult to defend every single data point, but this said, I think that's a measure of government efficiency. In this particular case, it seems that actually French courts are good in keeping the flow going, or the system is good at reducing the fraction of issues that are brought to court. So as part of the problem and lack of productivity of Italian courts is that the number of cases that brought in front of judges in Italy is much, much larger. The entire France has the same number of lawyers as the city of Rome. So in Italy, there are definitely too many lawyers, at least from an efficiency point of view. Now, why there are so many lawyers? And some people can say because Italians are pretty feisty and so they go to court all the time. I tend to think is simply because there is no penalty to go to court. In a sense, in Italy, we have, these are civil cases, I'm talking now about criminal cases, but there are 3 levels of judgment. And if you appeal the first, you can't get worse. You can only get better. So it's a free option. And there is a statute of limitation that kicks in pretty fast. So if you just try, you might get free, literally jail out of free card if sort of enough time expires. And so the entire system is designed to slow down. So that's the...
Let's take a couple more. Could you go to the fellow in the back?
Thank you. I have a question. Incoming and hopefully successful capital markets union, would you assume that if successful, it could change a manager environment and culture in Mediterranean countries, especially what you mentioned, the personal relationship between management and banks, and consequently improve performance?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is, of course, yes, to the extent this is without restriction. So if you allow free entry of, let's call them foreigners, even if I think it would be unfair to call foreigners other European fellow, but in Italy we call foreigners the one in the next province. So, but so if you allow sort of people from other parts of Europe to move freely, that's definitely the case. Unfortunately, and I think Italy is not the worst offender in this, there is a lot of economic patriotism. And I think very highly of patriotism. I think very poorly of economic patriotism because it's just a good flag to hide the worst interest. And so my answer is, if we liberalize and make it easy and easier to exit and enter, you're absolutely right. At the end, if there is free competition, we'll take care of everything. Unfortunately, I'm not as confident that the European Union will be able to go in that direction.
So I'll ask it. You know, I really like the approach that you took very much, and I have agreed with you that competitiveness is really at the key of what's going on in Southern Europe, and you've given some great mechanisms for it. Would you agree that this also, in some sense, explains some aspects of the European crisis? I know you didn't want to get into it, but my view would be that that the adjustment of subsidizing housing in Spain and government expenditure excesses in Italy and Greece and Portugal were largely a response to lack of competitiveness in the sense that your sort of Balassa-Samuelson mechanism makes you have to go into non-tradable goods like government spending or housing or something to try to compensate for the productivity growth problems. Do you buy that mechanism?
Yes, I definitely buy that mechanism. In addition, I think there is a very interesting question that people have not, I think, discussed enough, is what happens when you flood an inefficient financial sector with a lot of capital? Because that's exactly what happened to Spain, Ireland, and Greece. Italy is maybe in Italy was so inefficient it even did not reach anywhere. But in Spain, this huge amount of capital went all in the construction rather than going to sort of produce something. And in part is sort of the inefficiency there, but in part is also a financial sector that was a bit too narrow and myopic to understand that.